My name is Susan. I am 30 years old. Yesterday afternoon, my stepmother walked up to me while I was standing next to my father's bronze urn. She did not offer a hug. She did not offer condolences. Instead, she reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, and tossed it directly at my chest. It hit my collarbone and fluttered down, landing on the terracotta tiles right at my feet. She looked at the crowd of wealthy country club guests gathered on the lanai and announced that my father left me exactly $1 because he always considered my accounting career a mundane disappointment. Before I tell you what my lawyer pulled out of his briefcase just a few seconds later, take a moment to like and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories. Drop a comment below telling me your age and the hardest betrayal you ever had to endure from a relative. The air in Naples, Florida, was suffocating that afternoon. The July heat trapped under the screened-in lanai felt heavy and damp, carrying the scent of salt water from the Gulf. I stood near the edge of the pool, wearing a stiff black dress, mourning a man who spent his life avoiding conflict. Roxanne orchestrated the reception to look like a high society mixer rather than a funeral. Caterers carried trays of expensive appetizers, while her friends sipped wine. When she threw that dollar bill, the low hum of conversation stopped. Everyone turned to stare. Derek stood right behind his mother, acting like her personal bodyguard. He is 2 years younger than me, but Roxanne raised him to believe the world owed him a favor simply for existing. I did not deliver a sharp, witty comeback. The humiliation hit me hard and fast. My hands began to shake. The condensation on my glass of iced sweet tea made it slippery. My grip failed. The heavy glass slipped through my fingers and shattered across the hard terracotta tiles. Shards of ice and brown liquid splashed across the tops of my black shoes. My chest tightened. I looked down at the mess and then back up at Roxanne. My voice cracked, but I ordered her to step away from me. Derek let out a low, self-satisfied chuckle. He folded his arms across his tailored suit, acting like he had just watched a pathetic street performance. He told me I should take the dollar and buy myself a cheap cup of coffee on the drive back to Tampa. The security guard hired to monitor the front gate started walking toward the patio. He thought I was the disruption. He thought he needed to escort the grieving daughter off the property so the widow could enjoy her catered party. But before the guard could reach the pool deck, the heavy sliding glass doors leading to the living room slid open. Marcus stepped outside. He is the senior probate attorney at the firm my father used for 3 decades. He did not look at Roxanne. He did not look at Derek. He walked straight past the staring guests and stopped next to me. He held a thick sealed manila envelope in his right hand. He cleared his throat, cutting through the tense, humid air. He announced to the entire patio that the document Roxanne was bragging about was outdated. He held up the envelope stating he possessed my father's actual final estate documents, signed just 48 hours before his heart failed. The smirk vanished from Derek's face. Marcus instructed us to step inside the house. The transition from the oppressive humidity of the patio to the freezing air conditioning of the living room felt jarring. The sudden chill raised goosebumps on my arms. Roxanne tried to maintain her haughty composure, but the sharp shift in Marcus' changing tone rattled her. She gripped the collar of her designer silk blouse as we walked past the catering staff. Derek followed closely behind her, his arrogant posture replaced by a stiff, nervous energy. Marcus closed the heavy sliding glass doors, shutting out the murmur of the wealthy country club crowd. We stood in a room decorated with pristine white leather furniture and expensive, modern, abstract art. It was a space designed to project intimidating wealth rather than offer genuine comfort. My father paid for every piece of decor in this room, but he never looked comfortable sitting here. He always preferred the smell of diesel fuel and salt water. Marcus stood near a marble fireplace at the center of the room. He did not offer any soft introductory remarks to ease the tension. He simply unclasped the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal paper bound by a stiff blue cover sheet. He explained that my father executed a revocable living trust amendment just before he passed. The will Roxanne paraded around outside distributing single-dollar bills based on outdated grudges was rendered legally obsolete by this newer document. Marcus began reading the dense legal text. He bypassed the standard boilerplate clauses and went straight to the distribution of assets. He stated that my father spent his final weeks evaluating the trajectory of his coastal marine supply business and decided to restructure his final wishes. That company was the beating heart of his $4 million estate. It supplied heavy lifting machinery, industrial rigging, and specialized boat parts to commercial marinas all across the southwestern Florida coast. My father spent 3 decades building that enterprise from a single rented storage unit near the docks into a highly lucrative operation. According to the new trust amendment, Roxanne was removed as the primary beneficiary. Her name was formally struck from all operational control documents and financial directives. Marcus read the final paragraph outlining the new leadership structure. My father named me the sole successor trustee. He transferred the total control of the estate, the liquid assets, and the thriving marine business directly into my hands. I stood there processing the weight of those formal words. I was no longer the disappointing accountant relegated to the corner of the patio holding a broken glass of iced tea. I held the keys to his entire life work. The color drained out of Roxanne's face. Her pristine makeup could not hide the sheer panic pulling at her features. She tried to speak, but her breath hitched, catching sharply in her throat. She reached out, gripping the edge of the glass coffee table before her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the white leather sofa, gasping for air in genuine distress. The reality of losing her elite lifestyle hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She realized the exclusive country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, and this sprawling waterfront estate were slipping through her fingers in real time. Derek rushed to her side, shouting at the attorney. He demanded to see the signature, claiming the document had to be a forgery. He insisted my father would never leave a complex coastal operation to a woman who sat behind a desk crunching numbers in Tampa. Marcus did not argue. He simply handed Derek a photocopy of the notarized signature page. The ink was undeniable. My father had secured the amendment with 2 independent witnesses and a licensed notary public. For a brief, fleeting second, I felt a surge of vindication. The woman who just threw a crumpled dollar bill at my chest was now hyperventilating on her own couch, realizing she possessed nothing. But a victory against someone like Roxanne is never that simple. She married my father for financial security, and she viewed the prospect of losing that money as an existential threat. She did not retreat to a quiet room to mourn her husband. She mobilized her resources. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, I sat at the small kitchen island in my apartment. I was drinking black coffee and preparing to review the preliminary business ledgers Marcus had emailed me. My cell phone rang. It was Marcus. His tone was grim, lacking the quiet, commanding confidence he displayed on the lanai the day before. He informed me that Roxanne retained a high-priced litigation attorney based in downtown Naples. Her legal team moved with terrifying speed and precision. They filed a formal caveat in the Collier County Probate Court first thing that morning. I am a certified public accountant, so I understand complex financial documents, but probate law is a different arena. Marcus explained the brutal reality of this specific Florida legal maneuver. A caveat acts as an immediate judicial freeze on the entire estate. Roxanne officially alleged that I used undue influence to coerce my sick father into signing the amendment. She claimed I manipulated a dying man whose mental capacity was failing in order to steal her rightful inheritance. The legal filing triggered an automatic halt on all trust activities. I felt a sickening drop in my stomach as Marcus detailed the severe restrictions. The impressive title of sole successor trustee was currently useless. The court order meant I could not access a single corporate bank account. I could not sign checks to pay the marine supply vendors who kept the business running. I lacked the authority to make any managerial decisions regarding the coastal warehouses or the heavy machinery inventory. The probate judge placed the multi-million-dollar estate in a rigid judicial stranglehold until a formal hearing could determine the validity of the trust document. Roxanne essentially locked the doors to the empire and pocketed the keys. My brief moment of triumph evaporated into the humid Florida air. The conflict shifted from a fast, satisfying win into the terrifying prospect of a prolonged, financially draining legal war. Roxanne fought dirty, using the rigid structure of the court system to paralyze my authority. She knew I lacked the personal wealth to fund a drawn-out litigation battle against her expensive Naples lawyers. As an accountant, I knew exactly what happens to a business when its cash flow is frozen by a court order. Vendors stop delivering goods. Clients pull their contracts. The operation bleeds out slowly until there is nothing left to salvage. Roxanne wanted to bleed me dry until I surrendered the business out of pure exhaustion. She was betting that my modest savings would run out long before a judge ever reviewed the evidence. I hung up the phone, staring at the cold cup of coffee on my counter. I realized the real fight was just beginning, and I was entering a battlefield where the opponent held all the weapons. The business was sitting vulnerable on the coast, and I needed to figure out exactly what condition it was in before Derek could use the legal freeze to his advantage. A week passed under the heavy shadow of the probate freeze. The Collier County court order paralyzed my ability to manage the financial accounts, but I knew I needed to secure the physical inventory logs before Derek could tamper with the paper trail. I drove south down Interstate 75, heading back toward the coast. The midsummer heat radiating off the asphalt created shimmering mirages on the highway. I merged onto the local roads, navigating toward the industrial waterfront district. The marine supply warehouse occupied a highly coveted strip of commercial real estate. A dense thicket of wild coastal mangroves bordered the eastern edge of the property, acting as a natural buffer between the industrial yard and the open saltwater of the Gulf. I parked my sedan near the chain-link perimeter fence. Before heading inside, I walked the length of the property to assess the current state of the operation. The main storage buildings featured towering corrugated steel walls designed to withstand severe weather. I looked closely at the commercial hurricane shutters, mounted above the loading bays. They were rusted wide open. The metal tracks were choked with dried salt, thick dirt, and debris indicating they had not been tested or serviced in months. My accounting mind immediately calculated the liability. A coastal warehouse operating with seized hurricane shutters was a ticking financial time bomb. The sheer negligence extended beyond the buildings. The yard itself was a chaotic, disorganized mess. Millions of dollars worth of marine inventory sat exposed under the punishing Florida sun. High-end center console, fishing boats, and luxury yachts rested on temporary transport cradles across the gravel lot. I checked the base of the cradles and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The vessels lacked the mandatory steel-ground tie-downs. A strong coastal gust could easily tip a yacht off its cradle, causing catastrophic hull damage. Derek managed the daily operations for the past year, but he treated this complex industrial yard like a personal playground. He ignored fundamental safety protocols, leaving my father's life work entirely vulnerable to the elements. I walked toward the dim back office, expecting to find my stepbrother lounging behind a desk playing games on his phone. I pushed the heavy metal door open. The aging air conditioning unit hummed a low rattling tune, struggling to cool the space. The room smelled like stale coffee, motor oil, and old paper. Derek was nowhere to be found. Instead, I found Roxanne sitting behind my father's old oak desk. She did not look like the pristine, elite socialite who threw a crumpled dollar bill at my chest the week before. Her posture was stooped and fragile. She held my father's worn canvas fishing jacket pressed tightly against her face. She was weeping. The grief in her voice was raw, undeniable, and entirely unguarded. The sound echoed off the thin wood-paneled walls, stripping away the intimidating aura she usually projected. She lowered the canvas jacket when the heavy door latched shut behind me. Her expensive makeup was ruined, leaving dark, uneven streaks across her pale cheeks. For a brief second, the armor fell away. She did not yell or demand I leave. She looked down at the frayed collar of the jacket and began to speak in a quiet, ragged tone. She told me about a decrepit, humid trailer park in Pasco County where she spent her childhood. She described the suffocating, stagnant heat of a metal mobile home with no air conditioning because her mother could not afford the utility bills. She painted a vivid, grim picture of eating expired canned soup in the dark, praying the collection agencies would not tow their only reliable vehicle away. The relentless humidity fostered toxic mold in their walls, and the constant threat of eviction hung over her head every single month. She admitted she married my father to secure a permanent lifeline out of that grinding poverty. Her ruthless drive to control the estate was not born out of mere greed or a simple desire for luxury handbags. It stemmed from a deep, visceral terror of sliding backward into an abyss she barely escaped. She fought dirty because she believed survival required it. She viewed my legal claim to the business as a direct threat to her physical safety and the safety of her son. She was not a cartoon villain plotting evil for the sake of malice. She was a deeply traumatized survivor who used wealth as a protective shield against a world that once left her to starve. I looked through the dusty office window at the wild mangroves swaying in the afternoon breeze. Those trees perfectly mirrored the bitter divide between us. Roxanne despised the mangroves. She frequently complained about their muddy, tangled roots, preferring the artificial perfection of manicured country club lawns and pristine golf courses. She viewed the wild coastal brush as ugly and unrefined, a reminder of the messy swamp she crawled out of. Growing up on this coast taught me the true value of those trees. Their deep, interconnected root systems are the only thing that holds the fragile Florida shoreline together when a Category 4 storm makes landfall. The ugly, tangled roots provide the actual security, absorbing the punishing storm surge, while the pristine, manicured lawns simply wash away into the ocean. Roxanne built her life on a manicured illusion of safety, while I learned to respect the messy, resilient foundation that actually survives the harsh weather. The moment of shared vulnerability vanished as quickly as it arrived. Roxanne realized she was exposing her deepest fears to her rival. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the dark makeup further. Her posture stiffened and her chin lifted. The hardened elite facade snapped back into place like a steel trap. She dropped the canvas jacket onto the oak desk and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her silk blouse. Her voice turned sharp and cold, dropping the quiet tone she used to describe Pasco County. She demanded I leave the property immediately. She pointed out that the judicial caveat stripped me of any authority to be on the premises or review the corporate logs. She warned me that she would call the local Naples authorities and have me arrested for trespassing if I did not walk out the door that very second. I did not argue with a woman operating on pure survival instinct. I turned around and walked out into the sweltering heat, leaving the warehouse and the vulnerable inventory behind. I thought the legal freeze was the worst obstacle I would face, but I underestimated the lengths a terrified family would go to protect their lifestyle. Derek was not just neglecting the yard. Realizing I was investigating the property, he decided to launch a preemptive strike to cripple my resources outside the courtroom, targeting the one thing I still controlled. I drove the 2 hours back up the highway to Tampa, seeking refuge in the predictable structure of my corporate accounting firm. For a decade, this job served as my sanctuary. I built my career far away from the chaotic shadow of my father's marine supply yard. I spent my days analyzing tax codes, auditing corporate ledgers, and finding solace in the undeniable truth of mathematics. Numbers do not lie, and they do not file judicial caveats. I believed my professional reputation was an untouchable fortress shielding me from Roxanne and her son. I underestimated the sheer destructive reach of a greedy man who realizes his unearned inheritance is slipping away. On Tuesday morning, I sat at my cubicle reviewing a quarterly tax projection for a regional hospital group. A calendar notification flashed across my monitor. It was a mandatory meeting request from the Director of Human Resources, scheduling an immediate sit-down in the primary glass conference room. The subject line was blank. I grabbed my legal pad and walked across the fluorescent-lit bullpen, assuming I was being pulled into a routine compliance review for a new client. I opened the heavy glass door and found the Human Resources Director sitting next to one of the senior managing partners of the firm. Neither of them offered a greeting or gestured toward the coffee pitcher resting in the center of the mahogany table. Their postures were rigid. The senior partner slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood, stopping it right in front of my empty chair. I sat down and opened the folder. The top document bore the official seal of the Florida Board of Accountancy. Beneath that was a formal intake form from our own internal ethics committee. I read the first paragraph and felt the blood drain from my face. Derek did not resort to petty tactics like leaving anonymous voicemails or posting rumors online. He executed a calculated, devastating strike aimed directly at the foundation of my independence. He utilized his current access as the warehouse operations manager to draft a highly detailed sworn affidavit. In the fabricated paperwork, he alleged that I was currently leveraging my certified public accountant credentials to bypass the probate freeze and siphon capital from my late father's disputed estate. He included forged expense request forms, making it appear as though I was attempting to funnel corporate marine assets into a private offshore holding account. The accusations were entirely false. The judicial caveat prevented me from even looking at the corporate bank accounts, let alone transferring funds. But Derek knew the truth did not matter in the initial stages of a corporate panic. He knew how risk-averse large financial institutions operated. The senior partner spoke in a low, measured tone. He explained that a licensed accountant accused of fiduciary theft and elder estate manipulation is a radioactive liability. The firm handled sensitive tax documents for hundreds of high-net-worth clients across the state of Florida. They could not risk a federal audit or a devastating public relations scandal by keeping an accused embezzler on their active payroll. I tried to defend myself. I pointed out the blatant inconsistencies in the paperwork and explained that the probate court had already frozen the estate, making the alleged theft mechanically impossible. I pleaded with them to call my probate attorney, Marcus, who could verify the toxic nature of the family dispute. The human resources director shook her head, interrupting my defense. She stated that the firm could not adjudicate a messy family inheritance battle. Protocol dictated their response. Because a formal ethics complaint was lodged with the state licensing board, the firm was legally obligated to sever my access to their network immediately. They suspended me without pay pending a grueling internal investigation and the final ruling from the state board. She asked for my corporate security badge and my company-issued laptop. My professional foundation collapsed before lunchtime. The career I sacrificed my 20s to build, the grueling late-night study sessions for the licensing exams, and the years of climbing the corporate ladder vanished with a single signature from my stepbrother. I walked back to my desk carrying a flattened brown cardboard box provided by the security guard. I folded the cardboard into shape and began packing away my life. I placed my ergonomic mouse, my favorite ceramic coffee mug, and my framed licensing certificate into the bottom of the box. I kept my head down, avoiding the curious stares and hushed whispers of my colleagues in the surrounding cubicles. The walk from my desk to the lobby elevator felt like a slow, agonizing march. No one offered to help me carry the box. No one said goodbye. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the lobby and stepped out into the brutal Tampa afternoon. The midsummer heat radiating off the asphalt parking lot hit me like a physical wall. I walked to my sedan, unlocked the doors, and shoved the cardboard box onto the passenger seat. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, sealing myself inside the suffocating oven of the car interior. I did not start the engine. I did not roll down the windows to let the stagnant air escape. I just sat there gripping the leather steering wheel as the temperature inside the cabin climbed. The shock wore off, replaced by a crushing wave of raw grief and searing frustration. I lost my composure. I let out a loud, ragged scream that tore at the back of my throat. I slammed the heels of my hands against the sticky leather steering wheel, striking it over and over until my palms throbbed and my skin bruised. The tears came fast and hot, blinding my vision as I sobbed uncontrollably into the quiet, empty space of the car. The physical pain in my hands grounded me, forcing me to face the terrifying reality of my situation. I was 30 years old, unemployed, disgraced, and cut off from my only source of income. I leaned my forehead against the hot steering wheel, drawing in shaky, ragged breaths. A dark, bitter question echoed in my mind. I deeply questioned if fighting for the legacy of a man who spent his life hiding from conflict was worth destroying the only secure thing I ever built for myself. My father left me a war I never asked for, and the casual cruelty of my stepbrother just decimated my livelihood. I sat in the sweltering heat, wiping the sweat and tears from my face with the back of my bruised hand. Derek wanted me to feel powerless. He expected me to retreat to my apartment and surrender the estate out of pure financial terror. He wanted to break my spirit, so I would hand him the keys to the coastal marine yard and walk away. I stared at the cardboard box sitting on the passenger seat, holding the remnants of my ruined career. Derek severed my ties to the corporate rules and polite professional boundaries I always followed. He stripped away the very job that kept me tethered to Tampa. He thought suspending my license would force me to quit. Instead, he inadvertently freed my schedule and gave me a terrifying new focus. I realized I could not fight a street brawler using corporate etiquette. If he wanted to weaponize the ledgers against me, I needed to find out exactly what he was hiding in the numbers he left behind. I sat in the sweltering car until the tears dried, leaving my skin tight and salted. I refused to let Derek see me bleed. If he wanted a frantic, desperate accountant fighting for her corporate life, I would give him exactly that performance. I pulled out my cell phone and launched a calculated diversionary tactic. I drafted a chaotic, highly emotional email to the Human Resources Director demanding union representation and threatening a wrongful termination lawsuit. I purposefully used poor grammar and frantic capitalization to sell the panic. I specifically blind copied the primary address of the Naples litigation firm representing Roxanne, ensuring the leak would reach my stepbrother within the hour. I spent the next 2 days calling the state licensing board, leaving frantic voicemails complaining about the injustice of my suspension. I created a loud public spectacle of professional panic. The bait worked flawlessly. Through mutual acquaintances still working at the Tampa firm, I heard Derek was actively gloating. He spent his evenings at the country club, buying rounds of top-shelf bourbon for his friends, bragging that he had successfully tied me up in bureaucratic red tape. He believed I was trapped in my apartment, buried under legal paperwork, and paralyzed by the loss of my career. He let his guard down, assuming the coastal yard was secure from my oversight. While Derek celebrated my ruin, I waited for the sun to drop below the horizon. Under the cover of total darkness, I threw a dark hooded sweatshirt into the passenger seat and drove south down the interstate back toward Naples. The midnight traffic was sparse, allowing me to cover the distance in under 2 hours. The transition from the bright city lights of Tampa to the desolate stretches of highway bordering the Everglades offered a stark contrast to my internal focus. I parked my sedan a quarter-mile away from the marine supply yard, hiding the vehicle behind a dense thicket of overgrown palmetto bushes. The coastal air was thick and humid, carrying the sharp scent of decaying seaweed and diesel fuel. I walked the remaining distance on foot, sticking to the shadows along the chain-link perimeter fence. I knew the main gates were locked and monitored by security cameras. Instead, I navigated toward the eastern edge of the property, where the wild mangroves encroached on the industrial lot. The tangled roots provided excellent cover. I squeezed through a known gap in the rusted wire, slipping onto the gravel lot unseen. The humid air clung to my skin, making my clothes stick to my back as I navigated the unlit yard. The property was quiet, save for the rhythmic sloshing of the tide against the wooden docks. I crouched behind a shrink-wrapped transport cradle, holding a 60-foot yacht. Footsteps crunched on the gravel nearby. Derek employed a night manager named Vince, a burly man who spent more time sleeping in his pickup truck than walking the perimeter. But tonight, Vince was awake, holding a heavy steel flashlight, pacing the lane between the storage bays. I watched the beam of his flashlight sweep across the gravel, just inches from my hiding spot. I held my breath, pressing my back against the rough fiberglass hull of the boat. I waited until Vince turned the corner, whistling a low off-key tune, before I darted across the open lane toward the rear storage office. The heavy metal door to the back office required an old physical key my father had given me years ago. I slid the brass key into the lock, turning it slowly to avoid the loud click of the tumbler. The door groaned open, and I slipped inside, shutting it tight behind me. The air inside the windowless room was stifling hot and smelled of mildew. I pulled a small pen flashlight from my pocket, clicking on the narrow beam. I did not bother turning on the computer monitor. A man willing to forge a sworn ethics complaint to the state licensing board would undoubtedly alter the digital accounting files to cover his tracks. I needed the raw, unfiltered truth. I directed the thin beam of light toward the row of gray steel filing cabinets lining the far wall. These cabinets held the physical operating ledgers, the bank statements, and the carbon copy expense reports my father meticulously organized before his health declined. I pulled open the heavy metal drawer labeled Current Fiscal Year. The metal ball bearings squealed in the quiet room, making my heart race. I pulled out the thick green ledger books and spread them across the dusty oak desk. Applying my rigorous accounting expertise, I began tracing the columns of ink. I bypassed the surface-level revenue streams and drilled down into the fixed operating expenses, focusing strictly on the property overhead. My father built this company on a foundation of extreme caution. He always maintained top-tier commercial hurricane insurance on the waterfront warehouses, paying exorbitant premiums to protect the physical assets from unpredictable Gulf weather. I spent 2 hours cross-referencing the voided checks against the master ledger, ensuring my findings were undeniable. I scanned the monthly premium disbursements, and my pen flashlight stopped moving. The column was blank for the past 8 months. The cash disbursements for the insurance providers ceased shortly after my father's health took a sharp downturn, and Derek assumed control of the daily operations. I dug deeper, pulling the carbon copy expense reports and cross-referencing them with the mailed bank statements hidden in the back of the drawer. I uncovered a terrifying discrepancy. The Marine Supply Company was functioning as a hollow shell. Derek had secretly canceled every single commercial hurricane insurance policy, covering the waterfront warehouses, the heavy lifting cranes, and the inventory yards. He executed the cancellations to free up substantial amounts of liquid capital. But the money did not go into the corporate savings account or pay down vendor debts. He falsified the internal expense reports, making it appear to the accountants as though the premiums were still being paid. He took the lucrative premium refunds and funneled the cash through a series of shell-limited liability companies. I recognized the routing numbers from my advanced audit training. The funds were bleeding directly into offshore accounts, notorious for hosting unregulated sports betting syndicates. Derek was drowning in gambling debts. He stripped the protective armor off my father's life work to pay his bookies, using the corporate ledgers as his personal slush fund. The true horror of the situation washed over me in the stifling dark office. The $4 million estate was sitting fully exposed on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. Without those insurance policies, a single rogue wave or severe coastal squall could obliterate the physical structures and the inventory, leaving the business bankrupt overnight. The judicial caveat meant nothing if the assets washed out to sea. I was standing inside a ticking time bomb built on a foundation of sheer reckless greed. I gathered the ledgers, returning them exactly as I found them, and slipped out into the humid night, carrying the terrifying truth. And as I walked back toward my hidden car, the warm breeze suddenly shifted, picking up speed and carrying the distinct heavy scent of an approaching coastal storm. The drive north on Interstate 75 was a grueling exercise in endurance. The sky began to lighten, but it lacked the usual bright Florida sunrise. Instead, a thick band of bruised purple clouds hugged the western horizon over the Gulf of Mexico. The heavy, stagnant air I felt standing outside the warehouse earlier that night was not just a passing coastal squall. I turned on the local AM radio station, hoping the monotonous drone of the traffic report would keep me awake until I reached Tampa. The emergency broadcast tone pierced the static, jolting me upright in the driver's seat. The meteorologist did not sound like the typical upbeat morning host. His voice carried a tight, urgent edge. A late-season tropical depression spinning off the coast of Cuba had just stalled over unseasonably warm waters. The storm rapidly organized, drawing energy from the Gulf. In a matter of hours, it transformed into a Category 4 hurricane. The projected trajectory was a direct strike aimed right at the southwestern Florida coastline. The eye of the storm was tracking straight toward Naples. The stakes shifted in an instant. The tedious legal dispute orchestrated by Roxanne and the fabricated ethics complaint filed by Derek suddenly felt insignificant. We were no longer fighting a slow bureaucratic war of attrition inside an air-conditioned courtroom. We were locked in a terrifying race against nature. My father's marine supply business sat right on the edge of the water. The physical real estate occupied prime waterfront territory, but that proximity also made it the first line of defense against a coastal surge. Without the commercial hurricane insurance policies Derek secretly canceled, those warehouses were doomed. The corrugated steel and concrete foundations could not withstand a Category 4 wind event without the financial backing to rebuild. If the water breached the property line, the entire $4 million estate would be reduced to waterlogged rubble before the probate judge even scheduled a hearing to review the caveat. Panic is a rare emotion for an accountant. I am trained to mitigate risk through careful planning and strategic foresight. I balance ledgers and project fiscal outcomes based on hard data. But hearing that weather report triggered a cold primal fear in my chest. I pushed my sedan well above the speed limit, desperate to reach my Tampa apartment. I ran up the concrete stairs to my front door, ignoring the exhaustion burning in my muscles. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and immediately flipped open my laptop. I pulled up the contact directories for every major commercial insurance broker licensed to operate in the state of Florida. My plan was straightforward and reckless. The judicial caveat prevented me from accessing the corporate bank accounts to pay the premiums. Derek bled the company dry anyway, funneling the cash to his bookies. The only liquid capital I could access was my own personal savings. I spent a decade working grueling hours at the accounting firm, hoarding my bonuses and living well below my means. I sacrificed vacations and luxury items to build a secure safety net for myself. I possessed enough cash in my private checking account to cover the exorbitant emergency premiums out of my own pocket. I was willing to drain my entire life savings to reinstate the coverage and protect my father's legacy. I dialed the first broker on my list located in Orlando. The phone rang for several minutes before a tired agent answered. The demand for coverage was surging across the state as property owners woke up to the news. I explained my situation, leaving out the messy family politics. I simply stated I needed to reinstate a commercial windstorm and flood policy for a waterfront industrial property in Collier County. I offered to wire the annual premium in full that exact second. The broker let out a heavy sigh. His response hit me like a physical blow. He told me my money was useless. He explained the rigid laws governing the Florida insurance market. The moment the National Hurricane Center issues a named storm warning within a specific geographic coordinate zone, the state triggers a binding moratorium. This administrative mandate acts as an impenetrable wall. It makes it legally impossible for any insurance agency to write, bind, or reinstate a property insurance policy until the storm passes and the threat is officially downgraded. The risk is too high for the underwriters. They lock the doors and refuse to take on new liabilities when a disaster is already visible on the radar. I refuse to accept defeat. I hung up the phone and dialed a broker in Jacksonville. I waited on hold for 20 minutes, listening to static classical music before an agent repeated the exact same Florida statute. Then I called a boutique agency in Miami, hoping a smaller firm might offer a loophole for high-risk commercial properties. I spent 3 hours dialing every underwriter I could find on the internet. Every single phone call ended with the exact same harsh rejection. The geographic box was closed. The binding moratorium was active across the entire peninsula. My personal savings could not buy a miracle. I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen. The exhaustion finally caught up to me, settling deep into my bones. I was trapped in a suffocating bureaucratic nightmare. The Florida legal system froze my authority through the probate caveat, while the state insurance regulations paralyzed my ability to protect the physical structures. I held the terrifying truth in my hands. I possessed the physical ledgers, proving Derek embezzled the premiums. I knew the hurricane was gaining strength mere miles off the coast, but the rigid rules of the industry tied my hands behind my back. A deep, bitter frustration threatened to consume me. My father built that marine supply yard from nothing. He poured his blood and sweat into those warehouses, working grueling hours in the Florida heat. And now, because his stepson wanted a quick payout to cover gambling debts, the ocean was going to swallow the property whole. A single powerful storm surge would tear the rusted hurricane shutters off the tracks, flood the storage bays, and wash the unanchored luxury yachts straight into the Gulf. The estate would declare bankruptcy, and Roxanne would be left holding a worthless deed to a toxic disaster zone. Have you ever seen a disaster coming, but rigid rules tied your hands? Tell me how you navigated that suffocating frustration below in the comments. I walked over to the window of my apartment and looked out at the sky. The bruising purple clouds were steadily marching north, blocking out the morning sun. The wind was already picking up, rattling the glass panes in their wooden frames. The sheer injustice of the situation burned in my chest, pushing past the exhaustion. I could not sit in Tampa and watch the local weather channel while my father's legacy washed away into the sea. Derek needed to understand the catastrophic magnitude of his greed. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter. The storm was less than 3 days away, and I was driving back to Naples to hunt down my stepbrother. I turned the car around and drove south again. The highway felt like a concrete treadmill running against a darkening sky. The evacuation warnings had not yet triggered a mandatory exodus, but the tension in the air hung thick and electric. I navigated the familiar coastal roads of Naples, heading straight toward the historic wooden pier. October in southwestern Florida marks the beginning of stone crab season. Tourists and locals alike flock to the waterfront eateries to consume the sweet meat served over ice with mustard sauce. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a popular open-air seafood shack. The approaching tropical system did not deter the afternoon crowd. Patrons sat under wide canvas umbrellas, oblivious to the falling barometric pressure. A steel drum band played loud, rhythmic reggae music from a small wooden stage near the water. The smell of fried grouper and salty sea spray filled my lungs as I walked up the wooden ramp. I spotted Derek immediately. He occupied a prime corner booth overlooking the Gulf. He wore a crisp white linen shirt and dark sunglasses, holding a cold beer in one hand and a steel claw cracker in the other. He looked like a man on vacation without a single care in the world. I did not plan a cinematic entrance. My adrenaline spiked, flooding my veins with a cold, chaotic energy. I marched right up to his table and slammed both of my hands flat against the sticky, wooden surface. The iced drinks rattled. Derek slowly lowered his sunglasses, peering over the rims. He did not look startled. He just looked annoyed by the interruption. I intended to deliver a sharp, calculated threat. I wanted to tell him I possessed the physical ledgers, proving his embezzlement, and that I would drag him in front of the probate judge before nightfall to lift the caveat. But the confrontation did not unfold like a polished courtroom drama. My voice shook. The loud, thumping bass of the reggae music forced me to shout, and the sheer exhaustion of the past 2 days caught up with me. I stammered, tripping over my own words, as I accused him of canceling the commercial hurricane policies. I laid out the financial reality of the storm rushing toward the coast. I tried to make him understand that his greed placed the entire $4 million estate in direct jeopardy. Derek did not flinch. He did not panic or offer a weak defensive lie. He picked up a thick orange stone crab claw from the bucket of ice in the center of the table. He positioned the heavy shell inside the steel cracker and squeezed the handles. The shell fractured with a loud, sharp crack that echoed over the music. He pulled out the white meat, dipped it into the yellow mustard sauce, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, savoring the expensive meal while watching me struggle to breathe. He washed the crab down with a swig of cold beer and laughed. It was a dark, hollow sound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the sticky wood. He spoke in a casual, conversational tone, mocking my desperate panic. He boasted that the incoming hurricane was the best thing that could happen to him. He knew the warehouses were uninsurable right now. That was his actual design. He explained his terrifying logic with casual ease. The marine supply business required daily labor and tight profit margins. He hated running the yard. But the real estate beneath those buildings was highly coveted waterfront property. If the hurricane leveled the aging structures, he would not need to pay for demolition crews. The storm would wipe the slate clean. Once the old corrugated steel and concrete washed away, he planned to sell the vacant dirt directly to luxury condominium developers for millions of dollars. He would walk away with a fortune without having to lift a single piece of heavy machinery. The storm was not a threat to his future. The storm was his exit strategy. The sheer scale of his reckless ambition left me speechless. I stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. He canceled the policies to fund his gambling debts, but he also saw the impending natural disaster as a lucrative real estate clearing tool. My father spent 30 years building a reputable coastal enterprise, and Derek intended to let the ocean swallow it whole just to line his own pockets. I realized in that moment that threatening a man who wanted his own property destroyed was a futile endeavor. The legal leverage I thought I possessed held zero weight. If I went to the judge to lift the caveat, it would take days for the court clerk to process the paperwork. The Category 4 wins would make landfall long before I could hire a lawyer to draft an emergency motion. The buildings would fall. The inventory would sink. Derek would win. My shoulders slumped. The adrenaline crash left my limbs feeling like lead. I backed away from the table without saying another word. Derek chuckled, raising his beer bottle in a mocking toast as I turned around. I navigated through the crowd of laughing tourists and loud reggae music, feeling like a ghost. I descended the wooden ramp and walked out into the gravel parking lot. The wind was noticeably stronger now, whipping the palm fronds back and forth against the graying sky. I reached into my purse for my car keys, tasting the bitter sting of total defeat. I had the truth, but the truth was useless against the ticking clock of a hurricane. The crunching sound of heavy boots on the gravel pulled me from my thoughts. I turned around, expecting to see Derek coming to gloat one last time. Instead, I saw Hector. He was the head bartender at the seafood shack, a weathered local fisherman with deep sun creases etched into the corners of his eyes. Hector and my father shared a profound, quiet friendship spanning 3 decades. They spent countless early mornings navigating the choppy waters of the Gulf, hunting for tarpon, and sharing the kind of unspoken loyalty that only forms on a small skiff far from the shore. Hector understood the true value of hard work and despised the entitled culture Roxanne and her son brought into my father's life. Hector stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a stained white apron. His jaw was set in a tight, grim line. He told me he overheard the entire exchange at the table. He watched Derek crack that crab shell and brag about letting the storm destroy the legacy my father built from scratch. The arrogance disgusted the old fisherman. He knew my father was a flawed man who avoided domestic conflict, but he also knew Richard loved his business more than anything else in the world. Hector reached deep into the front pocket of his apron. He pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded yellow floating keychain. He walked over and pressed the cold metal into the palm of my hand, closing my fingers around it. The key looked old, the brass tarnished from years of salty air and humidity. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, ensuring the wind carried his words only to me. He revealed a secret my father guarded until his dying day. A year ago, my father sat on a bar stool right after a bitter argument with Roxanne. He realized Derek was reckless and unreliable. My father knew he could not stop the boy without triggering a catastrophic divorce. So he created a silent contingency plan. He opened a private joint safe deposit box at a small regional credit union down in Key West. He placed the account strictly in my name, and his name hidden from the financial records Roxanne and her lawyers could access in Naples. Hector told me my father left the duplicate key with him, just in case the family ever tried to lock me out of the estate. The old bartender looked past me, staring at the dark clouds gathering over the horizon. He warned me that the storm surge would inundate the lower Keys within the next 24 hours and the bridges would close soon. He urged me to get in my car and drive south. The answer to saving the business was waiting inside a steel box at the end of the overseas highway. I left Hector standing in the gravel parking lot and climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan. I gripped the tarnished brass key, letting the sharp metal teeth dig into my palm before sliding it into the center console. I merged onto the southbound lane of the coastal highway, leaving the reggae music and the oblivious tourists behind. The sky above Naples was rapidly transforming from a hazy gray into an ominous bruised purple. The barometric pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. In the distance, the low mechanical wail of the municipal evacuation sirens began to spool up their mournful pitch, echoing across the flat coastal terrain. The local authorities were preparing to mandate a full evacuation of the barrier islands. The electronic traffic signs flashed urgent amber messages, directing all residents to head north toward higher ground. Instead, I pointed my car south, driving directly toward the most exposed highway in the country. I merged onto Interstate 75, crossing the empty stretch of the Everglades before connecting to Route 1. The overseas highway is usually a breathtaking cruise over turquoise waters, but today it felt like navigating a concrete tightrope suspended over a churning ocean. The wind began to howl, battering the side of my car and shoving my sedan toward the guardrails. Oncoming traffic was heavy, a steady stream of recreational vehicles and pickup trucks fleeing the lower islands. My side of the highway was virtually empty. The geographic transition unfolding outside my windshield perfectly mirrored my own internal shift. I was leaving behind the artificial manicured lawns, the towering security gates, and the pristine, wealthy facades of Naples. As I drove deeper into the Florida Keys, the landscape grew gritty, humid, and unapologetically rugged. The salt-stained bridges, the weathered bait shops, and the dense mangrove clusters clinging to the porous limestone islands represented a resilient, stubborn reality. This environment did not pretend to be safe or perfect. It simply endured whatever the ocean threw at it. My hands clamped around the leather steering wheel as the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the driving tropical rain. The rhythmic thumping of the wiper blades created a hypnotic cadence, pulling my mind backward in time. I drifted away from the flooded highway and into a visceral memory from my childhood. I am 12 years old, standing barefoot in the dark carpeted hallway of our old house. The central air conditioning is humming, pushing frigid air through the vents, but the tension in the house makes the space feel suffocating. I am peeking around the corner of the painted drywall, watching my father sitting alone at the small kitchen table. The kitchen is bathed in the harsh white glare of the overhead fluorescent light. My father is hunched over his leather checkbook, wearing his reading glasses. His shoulders are slumped, bearing an invisible heavy weight. He is quietly filling out a payment voucher to the regional utility company. The account number written on the slip belongs to a unit inside the humid Pasco County trailer park, where Roxanne left her extended relatives. He is secretly paying their overdue electric bills, keeping their lights on while they struggle to make ends meet. He operates in total silence, terrified of leaving a paper trail his new wife might discover. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door leading to the garage slams open. Roxanne marches into the kitchen, bringing the heavy scent of expensive floral perfume into the room. She drops a series of designer shopping bags onto the granite island. She does not notice the utility bill or the checkbook. She immediately launches into a loud, piercing tirade. She demands to know why the dealership denied the financing application for the imported luxury SUV she selected that afternoon. Her voice is shrill and punishing, echoing off the hard tile floors. She berates him, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. She calls him weak and unambitious. She demands he pull operating capital out of the marine supply yard to buy her the vehicle in cash. She weaponizes her traumatic past, telling him she did not marry a business owner just to drive a domestic sedan like a common laborer. My father does not raise his voice. He does not stand up to defend his business or explain that tying up liquid capital in depreciating luxury cars is financial suicide for a seasonal coastal operation. He simply slides his leather checkbook under a stack of unopened mail, takes off his reading glasses, and nods his head. He apologizes for the inconvenience. He shrinks into himself, absorbing her venom to keep the peace. The memory faded, leaving me alone in the damp, cool cabin of my car. For years, I harbored a deep, quiet resentment toward my father. I thought his silence meant he favored Roxanne and Derek over me. I believed his lack of defense meant he agreed with their casual cruelty. But watching the Atlantic Ocean churn into whitecaps outside my window, I finally understood his actual motives. My father was not a cruel man playing favorites. He was simply a coward. He possessed a deep, visceral terror of Roxanne and her explosive wrath. He knew she was a woman driven by the trauma of severe poverty, and he lacked the emotional fortitude to stand in her way. Instead of drawing a hard boundary to protect his business and his own daughter, he chose the path of least resistance. He spent decades operating entirely in the shadows. He paid utility bills in secret. He funded contingency accounts without telling anyone. He rented safe deposit boxes at the very edge of the state to hide his remaining assets from his own wife. He built an elaborate underground labyrinth of financial safety nets because he was too terrified to face the monster living inside his own house. He knew Derek would eventually burn the marine yard to the ground. He saw the inevitable ruin approaching long before his heart gave out. But he lacked the courage to fire his stepson and face Roxanne in a divorce courtroom. So he quietly amended the trust and left a single brass key with a trusted bartender. He punted the inevitable war to the next generation. He left the heavy, lifting the ugly confrontation and the brutal legal fallout entirely to me. I pressed my foot harder against the accelerator, feeling the engine roar as I approached the 7-mile bridge. The overseas highway stretched out before me, a thin gray ribbon surrounded by rising, angry water. The sky grew darker, matching the storm brewing in my own chest. I passed another series of electronic road signs flashing bright amber warnings. I ignored the flashing lights. I was not the 12-year-old girl hiding in the dark hallway anymore, and I refused to inherit my father's cowardice. I watched the green mileage markers tick down as I closed the distance to Key West, preparing to unlock the steel box and finish the fight he was too afraid to start. The overseas highway finally terminated into the dense historic grid of Key West. The usual laid-back Caribbean atmosphere of the island was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic kinetic energy. The sky hung low, radiating an ugly, bruised purple hue that cast a sickly pallor over the narrow streets. Residents rushed to board up their wooden conch houses, dragging heavy sheets of plywood across their front porches. The wind whipped through the banyan trees, tearing loose leaves and throwing them against the windshield of my car. I navigated through the chaotic traffic, searching for the address Hector gave me. I found the credit union sitting on a corner lot. It was a small, sun-bleached cinder block building with faded teal trim. A maintenance worker stood on a ladder, drilling the final metal screws into a corrugated storm panel over the front entrance. I parked my sedan illegally on the curb and ran toward the building, shielding my face from the stinging rain. I slipped through the heavy glass doors just as the branch manager was turning the deadbolt to lock down the facility. The lobby smelled like damp carpet and ozone. The teller standing behind the counter looked at me with wide, nervous eyes. She could not fathom why a woman wearing business casual attire would drive south into a severe hurricane, warning while the rest of the state evacuated north. I did not offer an explanation. I walked straight to the laminate counter and placed the tarnished brass key on the flat surface. I handed her my state identification. She checked the name against a master ledger stored in her terminal. Her hands shook slightly as a loud crack of thunder rattled the drop ceiling above us. She verified my identity and gestured for me to follow her. We walked down a short carpeted hallway into the back vault. The heavy steel door stood propped open, revealing row upon row of small rectangular metal doors lining the reinforced walls. She navigated to box 409. She inserted her institutional master key into the primary slot and nodded to me. I slid Hector's brass key into the secondary slot. We turned them in unison. The internal tumblers clicked and the narrow metal door swung outward. The teller pulled the long rectangular tin drawer from the wall, placed it on a small viewing desk in the corner of the vault, and left me alone in the quiet, sterile room. I stared at the closed tin box. My chest felt tight. I expected to find a final emotional confession from the man who spent his life avoiding conflict. I braced myself to find a hidden flash drive containing audio recordings of Derek admitting to his financial crimes, or perhaps a handwritten letter begging for my forgiveness. I prepared my mind to process a heartfelt apology for leaving me to fight a ruthless war against his widow. I unlatched the lid and folded it back. The box contained no flash drives and no personal letters. Instead, I found a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound tightly by industrial rubber bands. I reached into the tin and pulled the paperwork out. The paper felt thick and official. The top page featured the raised, embossed gold seal of the Florida Department of State. I snapped the rubber bands off and spread the pages across the smooth formica surface of the viewing desk. They were state-certified ownership titles. Page after page revealed vessel registrations, heavy machinery deeds, and commercial fleet licenses. I engaged my rigorous accounting training, bypassing the standard legal boilerplate text to analyze the specific corporate structuring hidden within the jargon. I traced the routing numbers, the limited liability identifiers, and the official asset transfer dates. The ink was relatively fresh, dated just weeks before his fatal heart attack. My father did not just hide money to pay overdue electric bills for his ungrateful in-laws. In his final months, he executed a brilliant, highly sophisticated legal maneuver. In the state of Florida, commercial marine yards typically bundle their physical real estate and their operating inventory under a single corporate umbrella. That standard structure is exactly why the probate caveat filed by Roxanne successfully froze the entire operation in Naples. By locking down the primary trust, she locked down everything attached to it. But my father quietly broke that standard structure apart. He formally and legally severed the ownership of the mobile assets from the waterfront dirt. I read through the specific inventory lists. Every single luxury yacht resting on a transport cradle in the Naples gravel lot belonged to this new structure. The two enormous industrial travel lifts used to hoist ships out of the water, the fleet of heavy commercial transport trucks, and the specialized high-end rigging equipment were all detailed in these pages. These items no longer belonged to the primary estate Roxanne was fighting over. He transferred the titles of the mobile inventory into a separate, unencumbered limited liability company. I flipped to the operating agreement attached to the very back of the stack. I read the executive designations, and a cold, sharp sense of clarity washed over me. The documents named me as the sole managing director of this independent holding company. The brilliance of his strategy hit me with the force of a physical blow. Roxanne and her expensive litigation attorneys held zero legal claim to this specific entity because it existed entirely outside the primary trust they were currently fighting in probate court. The caveat she filed successfully froze the waterfront real estate and the primary operating bank accounts, but it held zero jurisdiction over this hidden, independent LLC. My father knew Roxanne would fight for the land, so he gave me the keys to everything sitting on top of it. The true wealth of his life work was never the aging, corrugated steel warehouses. The concrete foundations and the rusted hurricane shutters were just shells. The actual staggering value of the operation rested entirely in the mobile assets parked outside them. Derek thought he outsmarted me. He believed canceling the property insurance and letting the impending hurricane wipe out the buildings was his golden ticket. He planned to let the storm do his dirty work, clearing the lot, so he could sell the vacant dirt to developers. But Derek was sacrificing worthless, empty structures. He did not realize the multi-million-dollar inventory sitting in that doomed yard did not belong to the estate he was trying to liquidate. I held the undeniable state-certified proof that the inventory was entirely mine to control. The rigid rules of the Florida insurance market no longer mattered. I did not need to fight the binding moratorium. I did not need to beg commercial underwriters to reinstate the property policies to save the real estate. Let the ocean have the corrugated steel. I just needed to save what was parked inside the yard. I gathered the certified titles, stacking them carefully and placing them into my leather briefcase. I locked the empty tin box, shoved it back into the vault wall, and walked out into the lobby. The branch manager was waiting nervously by the front door, eager to evacuate. I thanked her, stepping back out into the punishing wind of the keys. The rain stung my face, but the sheer exhaustion that plagued me for the past 3 days was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. The hurricane was tracking straight for Naples, promising total destruction upon landfall. I had less than 24 hours before the storm surge swallowed the waterfront. I needed to get back to the mainland, find a judge willing to review these titles on an emergency basis, and execute the largest logistical maneuver of my life before the water rose. I unlocked my car, throwing my briefcase onto the passenger seat, and pointed my sedan north, ready to launch a counterstrike that would leave my stepbrother holding nothing but wet sand. The drive back up the overseas highway tested the limits of my physical endurance. The outer bands of the hurricane began lashing the Florida peninsula, dragging heavy sheets of blinding rain across the slick asphalt. Severe wind gusts shoved my sedan toward the concrete barriers of the 7-mile bridge, forcing me to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The ocean below churned into a dark, foaming frenzy, chewing away at the porous limestone shoreline. I drank stale black coffee from a dented aluminum thermos, keeping my eyes locked on the faint red glow of the taillights ahead of me. The traffic heading north was sluggish, congested with panicked tourists pulling cumbersome boat trailers and oversized recreational vehicles. I refused to pull over and rest. The titles resting inside my leather briefcase on the passenger seat represented my only ammunition in this war, and the window of opportunity was rapidly expiring. I reached the Naples city limits just after dawn. The typically vibrant coastal town resembled a deserted ghost town. Luxury boutiques and high-end seafood restaurants sat hidden behind thick plywood barriers. The traffic lights blinked a uniform warning yellow, directing the few remaining vehicles toward the interstate on-ramps. I navigated the flooded intersections and pulled into the empty parking lot of the Collier County Courthouse. Marcus stood under the brutalist concrete awning, wearing a wrinkled trench coat, holding a thick stack of blank legal folders. I called him from the road hours earlier, detailing my discovery in the Key West vault. He understood the severe gravity of the situation and skipped his morning office hours to meet me directly at the municipal building before the county issued a mandatory lockdown. We walked through the metal detectors, greeted by a skeleton crew of exhausted county deputies who were actively packing away their equipment. The standard judicial bureaucracy typically moves at a glacial, agonizing pace. A normal probate hearing requires weeks of scheduling notices, endless clerical delays, and tedious depositions. We did not have weeks. We barely possessed hours. Marcus marched past the primary clerk windows, bypassing the standard sluggish scheduling queue entirely. He invoked a specialized emergency legal maneuver known as an ex parte motion. This specific procedure allows a party to approach a judge directly without notifying the opposing counsel, provided there is an imminent threat of irreparable harm. A Category 4 hurricane bearing down on an uninsured multi-million-dollar coastal estate easily met that high threshold. Marcus led me down a dim wood-paneled corridor, stopping outside the heavy oak door belonging to the primary probate judge. Judge Aris was shoving thick law books into a leather briefcase, preparing to evacuate his administrative staff before the bridges closed. Marcus did not wait for a formal invitation. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the cramped chambers. The judge looked up, visibly annoyed by the sudden intrusion. He reminded Marcus that the court was officially suspending all judicial operations at noon and ordering all non-essential personnel to evacuate the perimeter. Marcus did not apologize for the interruption. He simply cleared a space on the cluttered mahogany desk, moving a stack of pending case files aside. He motioned for me to present the evidence. I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of state-certified titles I retrieved from the Key West vault. I laid them flat on the desk, detailing the separate, unencumbered holding company my father established for the mobile marine assets. I showed the judge that I was the sole managing director of that distinct entity, proving the inventory did not belong under the jurisdiction of the caveat filed by Roxanne. Then I delivered the fatal blow to their legal blockade. I pulled out the physical ledger copies and the forged expense reports I pulled from the dark warehouse office 2 nights prior. I placed them right next to the pristine asset titles. I pointed out the specific corporate routing numbers and the glaring missing premium disbursements. I explained in clear clinical accounting terms how Derek canceled the commercial property insurance policies to fund his offshore gambling debts, leaving the waterfront real estate entirely exposed to the approaching storm surge. I showed the judge that the current operations manager was actively committing severe fiduciary fraud against the very estate Roxanne claimed to be protecting. The annoyance drained from the judge's face, replaced by a rigid, grim expression. He picked up his reading glasses, sliding them onto the bridge of his nose, and scrutinized the forged ledgers. A judge serving in a wealthy coastal county understands the severe, catastrophic implications of property insurance fraud. The realization that a trusted family member intentionally stripped a highly valuable commercial yard of its hurricane coverage days before a major landfall appalled him. He looked at the certified titles and then back at the falsified expense reports. The false narrative Roxanne presented in her initial filing, painting me as a manipulative daughter, stealing a fortune, unraveled right there on his desk. Judge Aris did not hesitate. He pulled a blank judicial order from his printer tray and grabbed a heavy gold fountain pen. He stated in a firm voice that the court could not allow an estate to suffer catastrophic financial ruin due to the fraudulent, reckless actions of an unverified beneficiary. He drafted the emergency injunction in quick, sharp strokes. He officially struck down the caveat filed by the Naples litigation firm, lifting the judicial freeze entirely. Furthermore, he signed a secondary explicit order granting me full emergency executive powers as the sole acting trustee of the primary estate. He stamped the documents with the official county seal and handed the wet ink papers across the desk. The paper felt heavy, carrying the undeniable weight of the law. I thanked him, placing the signed orders safely into my briefcase alongside the titles. We walked back out into the echoing courthouse lobby. The legal tide just turned in my favor, overturning the paralyzing blockade Roxanne spent thousands of dollars to build. I possessed the undeniable legal authority to access the corporate funds, hire outside contractors, and manage the industrial yard without interference. But the victory offered no immediate relief. As Marcus and I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the municipal building, a sharp, powerful gust of wind nearly knocked me backward onto the tile floor. The sky was now a solid churning wall of dark gray, obliterating the morning sun. The horizontal rain stung my cheeks like tiny sharp needles. The court order inside my briefcase served as a powerful, impenetrable shield against my stepbrother, but it held zero jurisdiction over the ocean. The National Weather Service just issued an updated emergency bulletin on my phone. The storm accelerated during the night, drawing immense power from the warm Gulf waters. We no longer had a comfortable buffer to plan our next move. The hurricane was now less than 12 hours away from making direct landfall on the Naples coastline. I held the keys to the kingdom, but I needed to execute the most dangerous logistical operation of my life before the rising water rushed in to claim the throne. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan inside the courthouse parking lot, listening to the steady drumming of the rain against the roof. Marcus drove away to secure his own home, leaving me alone with the fresh court orders and the certified titles resting on my passenger seat. The clock on my dashboard read 8 in the morning. The meteorologist predicted the leading edge of the storm surge would inundate the Naples coastline just after sunset. I opened my laptop and connected to a mobile cellular hotspot. Utilizing the emergency executive powers granted by Judge Aris bypassed the local retail branch and logged directly into the primary corporate banking portal. The judicial injunction cleared the caveat hold, instantly granting me unfettered access. I stared at the screen, viewing the substantial liquid cash reserves my father accumulated over his lifetime. A sudden sharp clarity washed over me. I did not need to waste precious hours arguing with insurance underwriters or begging for a loophole in the state-binding moratorium. Let the Florida property market enforce its rigid rules. The actual value of the estate was never tied to the dirt or the aging corrugated steel warehouses. The staggering wealth sat on top of the gravel, resting on temporary transport cradles. I formulated a tactical extraction maneuver designed to outsmart both my stepbrother and the ocean. During my tenure at the Tampa accounting firm, I spent 3 years auditing the regional logistics and heavy freight companies that operated across the peninsula. I knew exactly which firms possessed the specialized equipment required to move oversized marine vessels, and I knew their precise operational margins. I dialed the emergency dispatch number for a premier heavy-haul transport company based in Central Florida. The dispatcher answered, sounding exhausted and overwhelmed by the statewide evacuation demands. I did not negotiate or ask for a favor. I offered triple the standard commercial hazard pay rate to mobilize a fleet of specialized marine haulers and flatbed trucks immediately. The sheer volume of liquid cash I guaranteed up front secured their swift compliance. I put the car in gear and drove straight back to the waterfront industrial district. The sky was an impenetrable canopy of bruised charcoal, blocking out the morning sun entirely. The wind sheared across the pavement, pushing saltwater spray far inland and bending the street signs. I pulled up to the chain-link perimeter fence of the marine yard. Derek had locked the front gates, assuming the caveat would keep me out until the storm finished his dirty work. I pulled a heavy iron tire iron from my trunk and struck the cheap brass padlock, breaking the shackle in 2 swift blows. I pushed the heavy metal gates open, allowing the howling wind to sweep through the empty lot. The yard was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual shouts from the dock workers and the grinding gears of the forklifts. Within 2 hours, the deep vibrating rumble of heavy diesel engines overpowered the ambient noise of the approaching hurricane. A convoy of 10 specialized flatbed trucks and wide-load marine transport haulers rolled onto the gravel lot. The logistics crew stepped out of their cabs wearing bright yellow waterproof gear. Their foreman, a grizzled man accustomed to dangerous coastal work, jogged over to my car. I handed him the certified inventory manifest, detailing the weight and dimensions of every single asset on the property. We did not waste a single second. The rain began to blow sideways, stinging my face like shattered glass as I directed the operation. The crews fired up the immense industrial travel lifts. We targeted the highest value assets, first prioritizing the fleet that generated the most revenue. The hydraulic winches shrieked in protest against the rising wind, hoisting the enormous fiberglass hulls of the luxury yachts high into the air. The operators carefully lowered the multi-million-dollar vessels onto the padded beds of the transport trucks. The logistics workers scrambled over the slippery decks, strapping the ships down with thick industrial ratchet ties, securing them against the fierce sway of the highway. Once the yachts were loaded, we moved to the heavy machinery. The crews drove the specialized lifting cranes, the expensive marine engines, and the high-value rigging equipment directly onto the lowboy flatbeds. The physical exertion required to orchestrate the extraction was staggering. My clothes were soaked, clinging to my freezing skin, and my boots were heavy with mud and gravel. But the adrenaline surging through my veins burned away the chill. I checked every item off the inventory manifest, matching the asset identification numbers against the certified titles in my briefcase. I watched the physical wealth of my father's legacy being lifted off the doomed coastal dirt and strapped onto 18 wheels of salvation. My father never spoke about his contingency plans, but his meticulous financial records always hinted at a deep, underlying paranoia. Years ago, he secured an expansive concrete storage bunker in the center of the state, specifically engineered to withstand extreme wind events and inland flooding. He paid the annual lease on that Orlando facility in cash, keeping it off the primary corporate ledgers Roxanne monitored. He prepared a safe harbor for his fleet, knowing a storm would eventually threaten the coast. He just needed someone with the nerve to execute the logistics. The grueling evacuation operation took 6 continuous hours of intense coordinated labor. By late afternoon, the ambient light faded into a premature pitch-black darkness lit only by the sweeping amber hazard lights of the truck fleet. The wind escalated into a sustained, punishing shriek, bending the tall coastal palm trees nearly in half and ripping the loose siding off the neighboring buildings. The storm surge was already pushing seawater over the concrete seawalls, flooding the lower drainage grates of the property. The salt water crept up the gravel, creeping closer to the tires of the flatbeds. I stood near the edge of the lot and looked around. The sprawling industrial yard was stripped bare. Not a single vessel, not a single forklift, and not a single valuable piece of inventory remained on the gravel. I looked at the towering corrugated steel storage buildings standing at the edge of the water. The rusted commercial hurricane shutters remained stuck wide open, exposing the cavernous, empty bays to the impending tidal wave. I did not attempt to close the shutters. I did not attempt to place sandbags near the doors or secure the loose scaffolding. I turned my back on the uninsured shells, abandoning the fragile real estate to the relentless power of the Gulf. I climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan, turning the heater on high to stop my hands from shivering. I keyed the radio microphone the logistics foreman handed me, giving the final clear command to the convoy. The heavy diesel engines roared in unison, blowing thick plumes of black exhaust into the turbulent air. I led the line of transport trucks out of the flooded industrial district, steering the fleet north toward the secure inland elevation of Orlando. The physical real estate in Naples was about to be obliterated, but the true, undeniable wealth of the estate was rolling safely down the highway, miles away from the rising ocean. I left Derek an empty, crumbling shell, while I drove away with the actual empire he tried so hard to steal. The hurricane made direct landfall just past 9 o'clock in the evening. The eye wall struck the southwestern Florida coastline with a terrifying, relentless force. The Gulf of Mexico essentially folded over itself, pushing a 12-foot wall of dark, churning saltwater over the concrete seawalls. The sprawling coastal business district stood no chance against the rising tide. Wind gusts exceeding 140 miles per hour shredded the aging corrugated steel roofs, turning thick metal panels into lethal flying shrapnel. Transformers detonated across the grid, flashing bright green arcs of electricity, before plunging the entire coastal peninsula into total darkness. The rusted hurricane shutters of my father's old warehouses tore off their ungreased tracks, plunging into the surging ocean. The storm showed zero mercy to the structures left behind. 2 miles inland, the scene painted a stark, contrasting picture. Derek sat inside the reinforced concrete fortress of a 5-star luxury hotel in downtown Naples. The building possessed its own independent commercial generators and thick, impact-resistant glass designed specifically to keep the harsh realities of nature safely outside. The lobby bar felt like an exclusive private club, insulated from the chaos ravaging the streets below. Soft jazz music played steadily from the ceiling speakers. The central air conditioning hummed, keeping the humid tropical heat at bay. Derek occupied a plush curved leather booth, holding a heavy crystal glass of top-shelf dark rum. He was not alone. 3 of his country club associates joined him, riding out the natural disaster with premium cigars and open bar tabs charged directly to his room. Derek always despised the marine supply yard and everything it represented. While my father spent decades with grease-stained hands and sunburned shoulders building an honest enterprise, Derek viewed physical labor as a humiliating curse. He grew up watching Roxanne manipulate her way into high society, and he absorbed her toxic belief that true elite status meant generating wealth without ever breaking a sweat. To him, the boats, the cranes, and the industrial rigging were just dirty obstacles, blocking a lucrative real estate flip. He resented the early mornings and the demanding vendors. He did not want to run a complex logistics business. He wanted a winning lottery ticket. The wide, flat-screen televisions mounted behind the polished mahogany bar displayed the local emergency broadcast network. The anchors spoke with tight, strained voices over the continuous loop of destruction. A news helicopter equipped with military-grade night vision cameras captured aerial footage of the industrial waterfront before the severe winds forced the pilot to retreat. The broadcast narrated the unfolding devastation, noting that the lower commercial district was entirely submerged. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, ignoring the expensive appetizers sitting untouched between the drinks. He watched the grainy green footage show the churning water, swallowing the exact geographic coordinates of our family lot. The tall steel storage bays were actively collapsing, folding inward under the crushing, relentless pressure of the storm surge. Derek let out a loud, triumphant laugh. The sound cut through the low murmur of the upscale bar, drawing a few annoyed glances from other patrons. He did not care. He slapped the table, rattling the crystal glasses, and flagged down the bartender to order another round of expensive imported liquor for his friends. He pointed at the television screen, acting like a victorious general watching an enemy fortress fall to rubble. He raised his rum in a mock salute to the fading structures. He leaned back against the leather cushions, unbuttoning the top of his crisp linen shirt, projecting total unbothered confidence. He boasted to the men sitting across from him, detailing his brilliant exit strategy. He explained that the hurricane was doing his dirty work, functioning as a free demolition crew provided by Mother Nature. He bragged about his foresight, detailing how he quietly canceled the exorbitant commercial insurance policies months ago. He told his friends he kept the premium refunds for his own private investments, letting the Gulf wash away the aging liability. He spoke with the unearned arrogance of a man who believes he possesses a supreme intellect. He mocked my father, calling him a stubborn dinosaur for clinging to a rusty boatyard when the real money was always in the dirt, sitting underneath it. One of his friends, swirling a glass of scotch, asked about the probate caveat Roxanne filed, wondering if the legal freeze would complicate the pending land sale. Derek waved his hand, dismissing the concern with a scoff. He assured the table that his stepsister was effectively paralyzed. He bragged about the forged ethics complaint he submitted to the state licensing board, claiming I was trapped in Tampa, crying over a ruined accounting career. He painted a pathetic picture of my defeat, entirely unaware that I spent my morning standing inside the Collier County Courthouse, securing an emergency injunction. He assumed I lacked the nerve to fight back outside of a polite corporate boardroom. His arrogance created a blinding fog obscuring the reality that I had already outmaneuvered him on every single front. He spun a narrative of effortless future wealth, painting a picture of total financial dominance. In his mind, the morning sun would reveal a clean slate of highly coveted waterfront dirt, ready to be parceled off to the highest bidding, luxury condominium developers. He calculated the projected millions in his head, already deciding which offshore accounts he would use to satisfy his mounting sports betting debts and secure his permanent elite status. He firmly believed he successfully outsmarted a rigid legal system, his dead stepfather, and the stubborn accountant sister who tried to stand in his way. He thought he won the war without ever leaving the comfort of a leather booth. The sheer magnitude of the dramatic irony hung thick in the air of that upscale bar. The audience watching him drink the expensive rum knew exactly what he was cheering for. We knew the warehouses washing out to sea were empty, hollow shells stripped of all tangible value. We knew the heavy lifting cranes, the transport vehicles, and the multi-million-dollar luxury yachts were sitting high and dry in a secure inland Orlando bunker, protected by state-certified titles he could never touch. Derek was actively celebrating the destruction of his only collateral. By intentionally letting the buildings collapse, he eradicated the only asset left inside the primary trust. He cheered for a catastrophe that would leave him holding nothing but insurmountable corporate debt and wet, useless sand. He was raising a glass to bankruptcy. He took another long sip of the dark rum, savoring the sweet burn in his throat. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored wall behind the liquor bottles, seeing a wealthy genius staring back at him. He remained entirely oblivious to the cold, hard truth hurtling toward him. Outside the reinforced windows, the hurricane raged through the night, washing away the last remnants of his unearned inheritance, setting the stage for a brutal awakening when the storm finally cleared and the courts reopened. The morning after the hurricane broke bright and unnervingly quiet. The Gulf of Mexico retreated, leaving behind a battered landscape stripped of its vibrant coastal charm. Naples resembled a war zone. I drove past the industrial waterfront 2 days later to witness the physical toll. The chain-link perimeter fence of the marine yard was gone, torn away by the tidal force. The towering corrugated steel warehouses no longer existed. In their place sat a chaotic, tangled mound of splintered wood, rusted rebar, and twisted metal beams. The ocean surged over the concrete seawall, scouring the lot clean before dragging the heavy debris back out to sea. The air smelled of decaying seaweed and ruptured sewage lines. The property was reduced to a barren stretch of wet sand and stagnant tidal pools. The physical shell of my father's legacy was erased from the map, just as my stepbrother planned. Later that afternoon, the Collier County Courthouse reopened, operating on auxiliary generator power. The hallway smelled of damp plaster and industrial bleach, a stark contrast to the usual polished mahogany scent. I sat at the heavy oak table belonging to the opposing counsel inside the probate courtroom. Marcus sat beside me, organizing his legal pads. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Derek strode down the center aisle. Roxanne flanked him, wearing a pristine tailored charcoal suit and oversized designer sunglasses. They navigated the debris-strewn city in a luxury rental car and walked into the courtroom projecting an aura of untouchable elite triumph. Derek did not look like a man whose family business just washed away into the ocean. He looked like a lottery winner stepping up to claim his oversized check. He sneered at me as he took his seat at the petitioner table. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive linen suit, looking remarkably well-rested for a man surviving a natural disaster. He assumed the judicial caveat Roxanne filed the week prior remained in full effect. He thought he possessed the upper hand, believing the hurricane forced my permanent surrender. He viewed me as a defeated accountant, showing up to beg for scraps from the ruins. Judge Aris entered the room, taking his seat at the elevated bench. He looked exhausted, running a hand over his face before opening the case file. Before the clerk could formally call the docket number, Derek stood up. He bypassed his own expensive Naples litigation attorney and addressed the judge directly. He spoke with the unearned arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way without ever earning the privilege. He informed the court that the waterfront real estate held in the primary trust was cleared by the recent storm. He pulled a glossy, thick folder from his leather portfolio, presenting a preliminary letter of intent from a prominent luxury condominium developer. He demanded the judge immediately liquidate the vacant commercial land, citing the severe financial distress of the estate. He laid out a rapid timeline, expecting the court to rubber stamp a multi-million-dollar sale to his waiting investors. He promised the judge that selling the dirt would satisfy the probate requirements, clear any outstanding debts, and generously provide his stepsister with a fractional payout for her trouble. He painted himself as the pragmatic savior of a doomed family enterprise. He stood tall, radiating smug satisfaction, expecting the judge to congratulate him on his brilliant real estate foresight. I did not interrupt his grand speech. I did not raise my voice or react to his condescending tone. I waited until the echo of his boastful demands faded into the hum of the auxiliary air conditioning. I stood up slowly, picking up a thick bound document from my briefcase. I did not present an emotional plea. I walked over and slid the document across the polished wooden table toward Derek. It was not a financial ledger or a forged ethics complaint. It was a certified physical copy of the Collier County Coastal Zoning Code. I turned to Judge Aris and directed his attention to the highlighted section detailing the municipal environmental regulations. I spoke in a clear, steady accounting cadence, stripping all emotion from my delivery. I explained the brutal legal reality of the waterfront property Derek was so eager to sell. 30 years ago, the county redrew the municipal boundaries to protect the fragile coastal ecosystem. They placed my father's specific parcel inside a highly restricted environmental conservation zone. The property only retained its lucrative commercial value because the old corrugated steel warehouses existed before the new environmental laws passed. The county granted the business a grandfathered status, allowing the marine yard to operate legally as long as the original physical structures remained standing on the foundation. I looked directly at Derek, watching the smug confidence begin to melt off his face. The color drained from his cheeks, replacing his sun-kissed tan with an ashen gray pallor. I explained the fatal flaw in his exit strategy for the benefit of the court. The municipal code dictates that if a grandfathered structure suffers total destruction and the owner lacks the insurance capital to rebuild within the exact same footprint, the commercial zoning permit is permanently revoked. There is no grace period, and there are no exceptions for negligence. Without the physical warehouses standing on the lot, the land legally reverts to an unbuildable conservation wetland. It cannot be paved. It cannot be developed. It cannot support luxury condominiums or retail shops. The vacant dirt he spent months scheming to sell was now entirely worthless to developers. No luxury builder would spend millions of dollars on a plot of land that the county designated as a protected swamp. By intentionally canceling the commercial hurricane insurance to pay his gambling debts and allowing the storm to demolish the aging structures, Derek executed his own financial ruin. He thought he was clearing the board for a massive payout. Instead, he eradicated his only leverage. Derek stared at the open pages of the zoning code. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. His hands trembled as he traced the highlighted legal text, trying to find a loophole that did not exist. He realized with sheer, suffocating horror that his brilliant plan to outsmart the system just bankrupted him. He destroyed his own collateral, leaving himself holding the deed to a useless patch of wet sand. Roxanne removed her designer sunglasses, staring at her son in total disbelief. The pristine elite facade she maintained for decades began to fracture under the weight of the revelation. She turned to her high-priced litigation attorney, silently begging him to object or cite a counter-statute. The lawyer simply closed his briefcase and shook his head, confirming the devastating truth of the municipal code. The courtroom felt heavy-laden with the crushing reality of their profound miscalculation. Derek sank back into his heavy oak chair, the arrogant posture collapsing into a hollow slump. He spent his entire adult life mocking hard work and manipulating the rules to avoid physical labor. He engineered a complex scheme of insurance fraud and sabotage, expecting to walk away a millionaire. Instead, his greed created a perfect, inescapable trap. He handed me the victory without requiring me to fight for the land. I stood at the opposing table watching the golden child realize his unearned inheritance just washed out to the Gulf of Mexico. The shock permeating the courtroom hung heavy in the chilled air. Derek sat paralyzed, staring at the county zoning code, realizing his brilliant real estate scheme resulted in his own financial ruin. His high-priced litigation attorney packed his briefcase, preparing to abandon a sinking ship. But the accounting was not finished. The court needed to see the full scope of the deception. The judicial caveat was dead, but the criminal liability remained unresolved. I reached back into my leather briefcase. The empty dirt sitting on the coast was just a distraction. I needed to show the judge where the true wealth of my father's legacy currently resided and who actually held the keys. I pulled out a thick stack of 8x10 glossy color photographs printed just hours earlier at a local pharmacy. I handed the first set to the armed bailiff who carried them up to the elevated bench. I slid the duplicate set across the polished oak table directly toward the petitioner side. The crisp images captured the cavernous interior of the secure Orlando concrete storage bunker. Row after row of multi-million-dollar luxury yachts rested perfectly on their padded transport cradles, untouched by the Category 4 winds. The heavy industrial travel lifts the specialized rigging equipment, and the commercial transport vehicles gleamed under the bright halogen lights. The physical empire survived the storm surge. It was simply relocated miles away from the destruction, safely parked behind reinforced steel doors. Derek looked at the photographs. The color drained further from his face, leaving him looking pale and nauseous. He recognized the inventory. He knew the staggering value of the assets resting safely in that inland facility. He also knew, thanks to the certified titles sitting on the judge's desk, that he possessed zero legal claim to a single piece of that equipment. The wealth he intended to inherit was locked away inside an independent holding company under my sole control. He sacrificed the waterfront warehouses for nothing. But outsmarting a greedy stepbrother was only half the equation. I needed to expose the root of the rot. I pulled out the final stack of paperwork. These were the physical carbon copy expense reports and the official bank routing logs I extracted from the dark warehouse office just before the storm hit. I laid out the forensic trail step by step, speaking in a measured, clinical tone to ensure the court reporter captured every single syllable. I detailed the shell limited liability companies Derek established using variations of our corporate name. I traced the unspent insurance premium refunds directly through those dummy accounts. I presented the wire transfer receipts showing the stolen cash flowing right into the hands of offshore sports betting syndicates based in the Caribbean. The dates on the wire transfers perfectly aligned with the weeks my father spent in the intensive care unit. While his stepfather was dying, Derek was looting the company coffers to cover his reckless wagers. I explained to Judge Aris that the current operations manager did not just make a poor strategic decision by canceling the commercial hurricane coverage. He committed deliberate felony wire fraud against the estate he was hired to protect. He stripped the protective armor off his own family business, placing the entire operation in direct jeopardy long before the tropical depression even formed in the Gulf. The judge reviewed the wire receipts, his jaw tightening. A probate judge deals with family greed daily, but naked corporate embezzlement triggers an entirely different judicial response. He signaled to the court clerk to make official copies of the criminal evidence. I gathered the original financial documents and pushed them across the table. I bypassed the defense attorney. I pushed the papers directly toward Roxanne. I wanted the grieving widow to read the undeniable proof with her own eyes. Roxanne built her entire identity around the pursuit of unshakable financial security. She spent her childhood suffocating in a cramped Pasco County trailer park, eating expired food and hiding from collection agencies. She married my father and terrorized him for decades, just to construct an impenetrable fortress of wealth around herself. She tolerated zero threats to her lavish lifestyle. She treated Derek like a golden prince, believing his inherent superiority would sustain her elite status long after my father passed away. She enabled his arrogance, funded his mistakes, and shielded him from the harsh realities of the working world, viewing him as the ultimate extension of her own success. Now she sat in a sterile municipal courtroom, staring at the printed routing numbers and forged signatures. Her hands began to tremble. The crisp paper shook as her eyes darted across the columns of missing cash. The realization hit her with staggering force. The one thing she valued above all else was recklessly obliterated by her own favored son. I did not steal her inheritance. The accountant sitting across from her did not ruin her future. Her own flesh and blood did. Derek stole the insurance premiums to pay his bookies. He let the ocean wash away their only real estate leverage. He bankrupted the primary trust, leaving her holding the deed to an unbuildable environmental swamp. The multi-million-dollar marine inventory sitting safe in Orlando belonged entirely to my independent company. She possessed no legal authority to touch a single dime of that revenue. The exclusive country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, and the sprawling waterfront mansion were slipping out of her grasp in real time. The immense debt left behind by the ruined warehouses would consume whatever meager savings she managed to hide in her private accounts. The psychological break was immediate and severe. The pristine, elite facade she maintained for 30 years shattered right there in the Collier County Courthouse. Her manicured hands shook so hard, the bank logs slipped from her grasp, scattering across the polished mahogany floor like fallen leaves. She turned her head slowly, looking at the young man sitting next to her. The golden child who just set their entire kingdom on fire. Derek shrank back into his heavy wooden chair. He tried to stammer a weak excuse, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of her glare. He reached out, extending a hand toward her arm, hoping for a comforting maternal embrace. He expected her to protect him, just like she always did when he failed a class or wrecked a sports car. He thought blood loyalty would shield him from her wrath. Roxanne did not offer comfort. She did not yell or launch into a loud, piercing tirade like she used to do with my father. In a messy, heartbreaking display of maternal betrayal, she raised her right hand and struck him sharply across the face. The loud crack of her palm connecting with his cheek echoed off the high vaulted ceiling of the chamber. Derek recoiled, pressing his hand against his reddening skin, staring at his mother in profound shock. The slap was not a cinematic gesture of triumph for me to enjoy. It was a tragic, visceral reaction from a broken woman, realizing she was heading straight back to the poverty she feared most. Roxanne collapsed forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the heavy wooden table. She began sobbing uncontrollably. The raw, guttural sound filled the room, stripping away her expensive tailored suit and her oversized designer sunglasses. Her ruined makeup stained the legal pads resting on the desk. She wept for the lost wealth. She wept for the elite lifestyle she sacrificed her morals to attain. Her blind, enabling devotion to a selfish son cost her everything she spent her entire adult life hoarding. She traded her humanity for a golden ticket, and her own child destroyed the ticket just for a quick payout. The judge watched the scene unfold with grim solemnity, tapping his pen against his leather ledger. The golden boy ruined the empire, and the matriarch finally realized she was entirely out of options, setting the stage for the final, brutal reckoning. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the judicial review. Judge Aris did not offer sympathetic parting words to the weeping widow. He gathered the physical carbon copy expense reports and the official wire transfer receipts, placing them neatly into a manila folder. He looked down at Derek with an expression of profound professional disgust. The judge announced his final ruling on the record. He formally referred the matter of the missing insurance premiums to the Florida State Attorney Office for immediate criminal investigation. He stated that the documented evidence indicated a severe pattern of felony wire fraud. The power dynamic inside the room inverted permanently in that single breath. The arrogant golden child who spent the morning demanding multi-million-dollar real estate liquidations was now an active target of a state criminal probe. Facing an imminent felony indictment, Derek sat frozen. He knew state prosecutors in wealthy coastal counties did not offer lenient plea deals to individuals who embezzled corporate funds. The reality of a looming prison sentence crushed the last remaining fragments of his smug confidence. Roxanne pushed her chair back, scraping the wooden legs loudly against the floor. She did not wait for her son or offer to help him stand. She turned her back on him, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag with shaking fingers, and walked out of the courtroom alone. She abandoned him the exact moment he ceased being a tool for her financial security. I placed my certified titles and the municipal zoning code back into my leather briefcase. I thanked Marcus for his swift legal maneuvering and walked out through the heavy double doors. The courthouse hallway was dim illuminated by emergency backup lights, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. The storm outside was gone, but the air inside felt heavy with the lingering tension of the legal slaughter. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed behind me. I turned around and saw Derek emerging from the courtroom. He looked terrible. His crisp linen suit was wrinkled and damp with nervous sweat. His posture was hollow, stripped of the arrogant swagger he carried just an hour prior. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap was closed tight. He called my name, his voice lacking any of its usual condescending venom. He closed the distance between us, stopping a few feet away. The pending criminal charges were not his only immediate problem. By inheriting the ruined primary trust, he also inherited the looming liability of the destroyed waterfront dirt. The County Environmental Board would soon issue exorbitant fines for the hazardous debris left in the wake of the storm. He was drowning in corporate debt, attached to a worthless patch of coastal wetland. Derek needed liquid capital to hire a ruthless criminal defense attorney to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. He knew public defenders lacked the resources to fight complex financial fraud cases. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperate. He begged me for a financial lifeline. He offered to sell me his remaining minority shares. Before my father executed his brilliant structural maneuver, he granted Derek a nominal 5% operational stake in the Logistics Limited Liability Company. It was a token gesture meant to appease Roxanne years ago. That tiny fraction of shares held zero voting power and granted no executive authority. It technically kept Derek tethered to the surviving corporate entity. He pleaded for a buyout, asking for $100,000 to cover his immediate legal retainers. He promised to walk away and never bother me again if I just gave him enough cash to hire a lawyer. I stood in the dim hallway listening to the man who tried to destroy my career. He expected me to negotiate. He thought I would offer $50,000 or perhaps a modest severance package just to be rid of him. He still believed his blood tied him to my mercy. I placed my leather briefcase on a long wooden bench resting against the marble wall. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic monologue. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against a small folded piece of paper I carried with me since the sweltering afternoon of my father's funeral. I pulled the crumpled $1 bill out of my pocket. The green paper was deeply creased and stained with a faint ring of iced sweet tea. It was the exact same bill Roxanne threw at my chest when she announced I was a mundane disappointment. I laid the crumpled dollar flat on the smooth wooden bench, smoothing out the wrinkled edges with the palm of my hand. I looked at Derek and delivered my counteroffer. I explained a fundamental principle of Florida contract law. A legally binding contract requires consideration, an actual exchange of value between two consenting parties. I told him I would purchase his minority shares. I offered him exactly $1. $1 for his total unconditional surrender of all claims to the estate. Derek stared at the wrinkled green bill resting on the bench. His jaw clenched and a flash of raw humiliation crossed his face. He opened his mouth to argue to demand a fair market evaluation of the operational shares. He wanted to scream that a single dollar was an insulting joke that could not even buy a cup of cheap diner coffee. But the words died in his throat. He looked at the hard, uncompromising expression on my face and realized he possessed zero leverage. He had no high-priced lawyers and no mother to shield him. If he refused my offer, he would walk out of the courthouse with nothing but a looming felony indictment and a mountain of environmental cleanup debt he could never repay. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a silver pen. His hand shook uncontrollably as he approached the wooden bench. The silver metal rattled against the wood as he signed his name on the blank transfer addendum Marcus provided. He pressed down hard, causing the ink to bleed through the thick legal paper. He signed away his birthright for a single piece of currency. I picked up the signed transfer document, inspecting the ink to ensure the signature was legible. I placed the paper safely inside my briefcase, alongside the certified titles and the court orders. I left the crumpled $1 bill sitting on the bench. Derek stood there staring down at the wrinkled paper, realizing he traded his entire inheritance for a worthless insult. He picked up the dollar, his shoulders slumping as the true weight of his ruin finally settled over him. I turned away from my stepbrother and walked toward the exit, feeling the heavy burden lift. 8 months passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell in the Collier County courtroom. The dust settled, leaving a permanent, undeniable divide between my past and my future. Roxanne no longer woke up to the sound of gentle waves lapping against a private concrete seawall. She woke up to the loud, rattling hum of a window air conditioning unit, struggling to cool a narrow metal box. The probate court liquidated the Naples estate to pay the mounting environmental fines, leaving the widow with nothing but a mountain of legal debt. Stripped of her elite status and her unearned income, she was forced to pack a single suitcase. She moved back to a cramped, humid trailer park in Pasco County. The manicured golf courses and catered country club parties were replaced by overgrown weeds and the constant, suffocating smell of stagnant swamp water. She returned to the exact desolate life she committed fraud to escape. I never visited her, but I knew the psychological toll of that regression was far worse than any prison sentence. She spent 30 years building an artificial fortress of wealth, sacrificing her morals and terrorizing my father just to end up right back where she started. She traded her humanity for a golden ticket, and her own greed set that ticket on fire. The elite circle of wealthy friends she cultivated abandoned her the moment her bank accounts ran dry, proving her status was always a fragile illusion. Derek managed to avoid a federal penitentiary, but his freedom came with a crushing, relentless price tag. The state attorney presented him with a severe plea deal regarding the felony wire fraud and the embezzled insurance premiums. To stay out of a jail cell, he accepted full responsibility, agreeing to a grueling schedule of court-ordered restitution. The luxury condominium developers and the offshore sports bookies stopped answering his calls the moment his assets froze. Without his mother to shield him or an estate to pillage the golden child, met the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working world. He secured employment at a local coastal bait shop, located just a few miles from the ruined Naples waterfront. He works the overnight graveyard shift, standing under harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. The man who wore tailored linen suits and drank imported dark rum now wears a stained synthetic uniform smelling constantly of dead shrimp and industrial bleach. He spends his nights scrubbing fiberglass coolers and ringing up live bait for local fishermen who treat him with the exact same casual disdain he used to show the dock workers. Every paycheck he earns is instantly garnished by the state leaving him with barely enough cash to afford a cheap cup of diner coffee. The manual labor he spent his entire life mocking became his permanent, inescapable reality. He spends his empty hours sweeping the floors, reflecting on the multi-million-dollar empire he traded for a single piece of wrinkled paper. He spends his brief breaks staring out at the dark water, listening to the tide roll in, knowing his own reckless greed washed his entire future out to sea. There are no shortcuts left for him to exploit. He is permanently trapped in a cycle of endless, exhausting debt. My own professional crisis resolved quietly shortly after the criminal investigation became public record. The Florida Board of Accountancy dismissed the forged ethics complaint, clearing my credential without a single blemish. The senior partners at the Tampa accounting firm realized their monumental error. The human resources director called me offering a formal corporate apology. She invited me to return to my old cubicle, offering a substantial salary increase and a clear path toward a junior partnership. A year ago, that phone call would represent everything I ever wanted. I spent my 20s believing that climbing the corporate ladder was the only way to insulate myself from the chaotic toxicity of my family. I sought safety in the rigid structure of tax codes and predictable biweekly paychecks. But surviving the hurricane and defeating my stepbrother taught me a profound lesson about real security. I listened to the director deliver her polished speech, and then I politely declined the offer. I did not need their glass conference rooms or their conditional corporate loyalty anymore. I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I outgrew the cubicle because I finally discovered I possessed the strength to build and defend my own empire. The corporate suspension was designed to break my spirit and force my rapid surrender. Instead, it forced me to step entirely out of the shadows and take firm control of a destiny I never thought I was capable of steering. I stood in the center of the bustling, newly relocated headquarters of my marine supply business. The expansive concrete logistics facility in Orlando sat high above the flood zones miles away from the unpredictable coastal surges. The cavernous storage bays echoed with the rhythmic hum of heavy diesel engines and the precise coordinated shouts of the logistics crews. The pristine luxury yachts and the heavy commercial rigging equipment rested safely in their designated sectors, organized with meticulous accounting precision. The chaos and negligence that defined Derek's management style were entirely eradicated. I hired the seasoned transport foreman to run the daily floor operations, paying him a premium salary to ensure the yard ran like a well-oiled machine. My father's business was no longer a vulnerable target sitting on the edge of the Gulf, waiting to be swallowed by the next storm. It was a thriving, secure inland enterprise, generating more revenue in a single quarter than it ever did on the coast. I walked across the polished concrete floor, holding a fresh cup of coffee, watching the supply trucks load their outbound freight. The air smelled of clean diesel and fresh wax, lacking the bitter salt of the ocean. I did not feel the need to gloat or rub my victory in the faces of the people who tried to destroy me. Revenge is a loud, messy emotion, and I preferred the quiet, steady rhythm of enduring success. I looked at the expansive warehouse, knowing I owned every single piece of steel and fiberglass under this roof. I fought a brutal legal war against a woman who fought dirty, and I outmaneuvered a stepbrother who believed the world owed him a fortune without ever breaking a sweat. I stood in the bright morning light, reflecting on the crumpled $1 bill resting inside my desk drawer in the executive office. I kept it framed as a silent reminder of the humid afternoon the war began on that patio. I realize now that true wealth is never about forcing toxic family members to respect you. Respect from greedy, hollow people holds zero market value, and chasing their validation is a miserable waste of time. True, undeniable wealth is possessing the quiet, unshakable competence to survive the storm. It is the ability to secure your own legacy, rebuild your foundation on higher ground, and lock the heavy steel door behind you for good.